Interrupt you, honey, respectfully. John Kirby is briefing reporters at the White House following that Biden-Netanyahu phone call.
You've said it from this podium several times that Hamas was the obstacle to getting some sort of ceasefire deal, calling on the Israelis to empower the negotiators, suggested that it's changed. Has the U.S. assessment of Israeli willingness to reach a ceasefire deal changed in the last several weeks?
No, look, it takes active participation and the negotiation of both sides here, and that's what the president is urging. He's certainly, in the call with Netanyahu, urging that the prime minister empower his team to the maximum extent possible to see if we can get this deal in place.
And then just on the substance of the real news from the president's statement there, saying that he's going to condition future U.S. support for this for the Israeli operations in Gaza on what Israel does. First off, what is at stake? What would be potentially cut off from Israel for use in this war if it doesn't change course? And second, what do you want specifically to see from Israel or to do to protect civilians and humanitarian aid workers?
I'm not going to preview any potential policy decisions coming forward. What we want to see are some real changes on the Israeli side. You know, if we don't see changes from their side, there'll have to be changes from our side. But I won't preview what that could look like. Now, they talked about I'm sorry?
Is that just the body count, or is there a specific change?
Again, in terms of concrete steps, what we are looking to see and hope to see here in coming hours and days is a dramatic increase in the humanitarian assistance getting in, additional crossings opened up, and a reduction in the violence against civilians and certainly aid workers. We want to see that even as the Israelis work through their investigation, that they are willing and able to take practical, immediate steps to protect aid workers on the ground and to demonstrate that they have that civilian harm mitigation in place. So again, those are broad brushes. I'll let the Israelis speak to what they will or won't do here. But again, in coming hours and days, we will be looking for concrete, tangible steps that they're taking.
Okay. Thanks, John. Just to go back to that point, in your readout, when you say the president made clear that U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by our assessment of Israel's immediate action, could you decode that for us? What exactly is the warning that's being issued here?
I think it's very clear in the language itself, Nancy. We're looking for concrete steps to alleviate humanitarian suffering in Gaza. Again, I won't get ahead of what the Israelis will or won't say or announce. We're looking for concrete steps to be announced here soon. And it's not just about the announcement of concrete steps and changes in their policies, but it's the execution of those announcements and those decisions and implementing them. And so we obviously will watch closely and monitor how they do on the commitments that they make. And as I said earlier, if there's no changes to their policy and their approaches, then there's going to have to be changes to ours.
I think what the world wants to understand is the White House warning that it may remove military aid? What exactly is the threat here?
I think I've stated it pretty clearly, and I'm not gonna, as I said earlier, I'm not gonna preview steps. I'm not gonna preview decisions that haven't been made yet. But there are things that need to be done. There are too many civilians being killed. The risk to aid workers is unacceptable. Now we have certain aid organizations that are reconsidering whether they're even going to be able to continue operations in Gaza while famine looms. So there has to be tangible steps. Let's see what they announce. Let's see what they direct. Let's see what they do. But I'm not going to get ahead of that.
Good, Mary. I'm going to try this one more time because the president.
I reckon you would.
That's what we do. The president seems to have said to the prime minister today, make these concrete changes or else. It's the or else that I want to make clear here. Is the president threatening to withhold aid to Israel if they do not make these changes?
The president made it clear that our policies with respect to Gaza will be dependent upon our assessment of how well the Israelis make changes and implement changes to make the situation in Gaza better for the Palestinian people.
And how much time are you giving them to make these changes, to implement these concrete steps?
Again, we would hope to see some announcements of changes here in coming hours and days, and I'll leave it at that.
That's short.
Hours and days.
John, why today?
Why today? What? Why today for the phone call? Why?
Why this apparent shift in policy today?
I think, look, President, well, all of us, but particularly the president, was certainly shaken by the attack on the WCK convoy and the aid workers. As I said earlier, it wasn't the only event. There had been others like that, humanitarian aid convoys coming under fire and losing people. And the president felt strongly that it was time to talk to Prime Minister Netanyahu about his concerns.
Would you characterize this call as an ultimatum?
I would characterize this call as very direct, very businesslike, very professional on both sides. And the president laid out his significant concerns about the direction and where things are going. And quite frankly, laid out, as is clear in the readout, that we are willing to reconsider our own policy approaches here, dependent upon what the Israelis do or don't do.
Can you just tell us who all was on the call?
Well, it was a bilateral call between the two leaders, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the president. They were the only two speakers on the call.
But Vice President Harris also dialed in?
Vice President Harris did dial in, yes. Secretary of State dialed in, Jake Sullivan, yes. I don't know who was also listening in on the Israeli side, but the discussion was between the two leaders.
MJ.
So, Admiral, you're not specifying what concrete steps Israel must take exactly.
I gave you some a broad sense of it. We want to see more crossings opened up. We want to see more trucks getting in, particularly from Jordan. We want to see tangible steps at the mitigation of civilian harm, particularly to humanitarian aid workers, but obviously all civilians. But we want to see that they have moved forward on proper steps to deconflict with aid workers as they move around, that the information flow is viable.
Sure, but that's language we've heard for weeks now. You're not talking about sort of telling us how exactly you will measure those measurable steps, right?
What I said was, we're going to examine our policy approaches based on our assessment of the way the Israeli side modifies their behavior, modifies their policy and decision-making processes. And so, first of all, let's see what they say they're going to do, and then let's watch and see how they execute to what they say. And I don't want to get ahead of them on what they plan to say about the changes they're going to make. But we'll base our policy decisions based on an assessment of how they execute to their policy decisions.
And you're not talking about what potential U.S. policy changes are on the table. Can you say whether the president shared that with the prime minister on this phone call?
The president made clear that absent changes in the protection of civilians on the ground, absent changes to the volume of humanitarian assistance getting in, absent any movement on a ceasefire that will allow hostages to get out and more aid to get in, absent a calming down, that he will have to reconsider his own policy choices with respect to Gaza.
And one of the 7 aid workers was obviously a dual American citizen. Did the prime minister offer the president an apology?
I'll let the prime minister speak to his side of the conversation. I would note that the Israeli Defense Forces, their Southern Command commander, has made a public apology for the strike.
And there was no mention of Rafah in this readout. Can you talk to us about how, if that did come up, and how that might have been discussed between the two?
This conversation was focused primarily on the need to get a temporary ceasefire in place, the need for there to be a pause in the fighting, so that we can get the hostages out, humanitarian assistance, the need to see that steps are being taken to learn from this strike and to make changes in the way civilian harm is mitigated from an operational perspective. And they did spend time, as the readout makes clear, talking about the very public threats from Iran to Israel. And the president, as I said, made very clear to the prime minister that the United States' support for Israel's ability to defend itself from a range of threats, not just Hamas, remains ironclad.
Good, Danny.
Thanks, Kareem. Thanks, Admiral. Just a couple of things. Firstly, how long did this call last?
It was about 30 minutes or so.
And just going back to, Jeff's question about the, why this sort of change in tone? I mean, has there been growing frustration on the part of President Biden that previous messaging to Prime Minister Netanyahu just doesn't seem to have gotten through?
Yes, there's been growing frustration.
Thank you so much, Kareem. John, one question on Israel and another on Venezuela. We saw in the past President Biden pushing Netanyahu to protect civilians, but how much words really matter here when on actions the same day of the attack on the humanitarian wards, the U.S. was approving more bombs to Israel? We are now 6 months into the war. How much the U.S. actions are actually encouraging Israel to not do enough to protect civilians?
Yeah, look, I'm kind of glad the question came up because I would tell you when I've seen press reporting, about the arms sales and that kind of thing, and I would just remind you that with the exception of the immediate 2 months after the attack, we haven't really sent emergency aid and military assistance to Israel. There was in the first couple of months. But what you're seeing here is the result of a process of foreign military sales to Israel that takes years. And a lot of this material that's been reported publicly was notified to Congress many, many months, if not years ago, and are in the train to get to Israel. I think it's important to remember, as I tried to mention in the last answer, that Israel still has a lot of threats it faces. I mean, we're all focused on Hamas, and I understand that, but they still face active threats throughout the region, including from Iran. And the United States still has an ironclad commitment to help Israel with its self-defense. And so a lot of these articles, including the 2,000-pound bombs and the F-35s, those are things that have been long in the train and not tied. The foreign military sales process was not tied to this conflict.
Can I have one more on Venezuela quick? Because yesterday, Nicolás Maduro enacted a law creating a province of Venezuela in Guyana, and he accused the United States of building secret military bases in Essequibo. So what is your reaction? And is the U.S. considering build a military base to support Guyana to defend their sovereignty?
There's no plans for a secret military base. And we've said many times that there's an 1899 arbitral ruling about the border between Guyana and Venezuela, and we want both sides to respect that ruling and to do it peacefully.
Thank you. You said we would hope to see an announcement of changes. I'm wondering if that is just hope, or is it an expectation? Is it based on a commitment?
We expect that there will be some announcements coming from Israel in the coming hours and days, but I want to respect their right to manage that process on their own.
Okay, and was there any update given by the Prime Minister on what exactly happened with the World Central Kitchen envoy?
They didn't talk about the actual strike in great detail. The Prime Minister did reiterate, as his military has reiterated, that this was on them, that the investigation was concluding, that he looked forward to seeing it, and that, he would take appropriate actions to make sure something like that couldn't happen again. I mean, they did, obviously they talked about it, of course. But did they go through point by point the investigation's findings? No, because I think the Prime Minister's office is still evaluating the actual investigation results.
And just to try to get a technical understanding, as you described the very long process of supplying arms to Israel, if this contingency isn't met and there is a change in U.S. policy, how easy or hard would it be to slow down or change shipments to Israel based on current law and all of the requirements and all of the things you just described?
Yeah, again, I don't want to get ahead of where we are. Let's see what the Israeli side does and says and what they implement and where they go before we talk about actual policy decisions. And I'm certainly not going to close down decision space for the President of the United States. He gets to make those decisions. But, I mean, obviously, as Commander-in-Chief, and yes, foreign military sales certainly is supported by legislation, but there are certain authorities that you can do to manage that. But again, let's not get ahead of where we are. This is really about seeing what the Israelis say they're going to do and then act on those changes.
Admiral, has the U.S. lost its leverage with Prime Minister Netanyahu?
You know, I keep getting this question about leverage. Israel's an ally and a friend and a partner. And the president believes strongly and has for his entire public career in the security of the Israeli people and the longevity of the Israeli state. And that's not going to change. I can say unequivocally, and I don't think the Prime Minister would mind me saying here, that in the call today, the Prime Minister reiterated his thanks to President Biden and this administration for the support that we have continued to provide Israel. It's long-standing. It was before the 7th of October, and it is now. And that support's going to continue. But again, with respect to Gaza, we need to see certain changes. And if we don't, then we'll have to consider changes to our own policy. But it's not about leverage. It's about the relationship, and it's about the credibility. I would even say the unique credibility that this particular president has in Israel and with Israeli leadership based on his long public service of support.
Talk about this relationship. Do you think the Prime Minister is really listening?
It was, I think it was evident in the phone call today. It was a good discussion, direct, no question, but a good discussion. And I believe the president made very clear his concerns, and the Prime Minister acknowledged those concerns.
In terms of the timing of this call, we understand that this call was set up after the strike on the World Central Kitchen workers. Would you say that this call was a direct result of that? Was that the reason behind the call?
Yes.
And then one last thing, response to Jose Andres, Chef Andres says that the convoy was deliberately targeted. Any response from the U.S. on that?
Again, I haven't seen the Israeli investigation. They have said themselves publicly after a preliminary investigation that there was no deliberate targeting of WCK and Chef Andres. They're working their way through now an independent follow-on investigation, which I understand is very, very close to complete. The Prime Minister just talked about it broadly and reiterated today, the Prime Minister reiterated today, that there was no deliberate targeting of that aid convoy.
Good night. Thank you. I mean, two questions. Senator Coons was very close to the president, said that we have reached a moment where arms restriction to Israel should be considered. Senator Warren also said that Israel has violated our own laws. Are they wrong in their assessment?
The president, I think it's clear in the readout, Nadia, that the president has made it clear today that if we don't see changes to the way the IDF is treating innocent civilians and aid workers and flowing the humanitarian assistance, that he's going to have to reconsider our Gaza policy. So, I mean, he was very direct with the Prime Minister about that. I'm not going to close down his decision space. As satisfying as that may be for some of you, I can't do that. But he made it very clear that we need to see some changes on the Israeli side.
I want to ask you about a very disturbing investigative report by an Israeli journalist who said that is the White House aware of an AI program called Lavender that's been used by the Israeli army to target operatives in Gaza in what they call a kill zone, where this program has only 20 seconds of human supervision. And it led to the death of thousands of women and children in Gaza. Are you aware of it, number one? And second, does the White House believe that AI can be used in this way without supervision?
I'm not aware of it. You're going to have to let me take that question. We'll get back to you.
Thank you so much, John. I'm going to start with the Trilateral Summit, then I'm going to move on to Rwanda. First of all, looking ahead to the Trilateral Summit next week, what are some of the priorities? And we recently heard the Filipino ambassador say that the U.S., Japan, and the Philippines are going to start joint patrols in the South China Sea very soon. Can you confirm that and give us any details?
I believe the Pentagon will have more to say about that this afternoon.
Okay. You have been listening to John Kirby. He is the U.S. National Security Council spokesman. He is the one who is often the face of the administration on many of the Gaza/Israel questions by the media, and he was just briefing the White House press corps following the phone call between Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu. So this is kind of how these things work. Let's bring in Mahjoub Zoueri, director of the Gulf Studies Center at Qatar University. I was saying it's how these things work. Usually, step one, you get the headline, right? what did the two leaders say?
Yes.
And then step two, the media gets briefed, and you kind of get the explanation.
Yes.
The official version of the explanation behind the headlines. What do you make of everything we've just heard?
In previous phone calls, this kind of press conference used to explain what happened and sometimes minimize the level of the statement or the discussion, saying, it wasn't as being reflected in the media. What I noticed that the language used by the spokesperson is actually reflecting to some extent what's been basically leaked in the last 2 hours. As we were talk about change, the Israeli commitment, the Israelis.
That's a word we heard a lot. There needs to be change.
There needs to be change, and that's something new. Previously, the spokesperson of the White House, or the spokesperson of national security, or the Department of State, they used to diffuse the level of the strength of that statement. Yeah. Now we see it's actually consistent. At least now we are about 3 hours. The statements from Washington are consistent. That itself telling.
Yeah, it's their way of sort of nudging how the media is going to frame a certain event. And this time, as you say, sometimes they'll dial it back.
Yes.
They'll modulate what the headline says. This time they're saying, no, you read this right.
Yes.
The U.S. president essentially excoriated the Israeli prime minister, and he told him, you have got to change something now. He was asked on a timeline, by when do these changes need to happen?
Yeah.
He said hours or days.
Correct. And to link to that, the reflection in the Israeli media, they talk about what Netanyahu commitments to Biden in that phone call. It seems that there were a list of things Netanyahu was asked. He gave a promise that this will happen. And now the Israeli media talked about, they try to predict what are these kind of commitments, and they put the same question you have said. For how long? And when do we expect this to happen?
Yeah.
It seems that, looking at the language used by the White House so far, it seems things as days and hours maybe.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say when the White House puts out messaging like this, then the Israeli prime minister, the counterpart, is going to have to give something.
Yeah, and there is another interesting thing. It's talking about immediate ceasefire. That is also was mentioned to improve the humanitarian thing. That is a new language, an immediate ceasefire to improve the humanitarian situation.
Okay, I have to run. There's so much news to get to, but thank you so much, Malshub Zoueri, for joining us in the studio.